I've got very interesting people coming from totally different backgrounds and different religious traditions to speak. It's going to go like this. Each of them will speak for about 7 minutes, telling us where they are and where they've come from, where they stand in relation to their own religious community. And then I'm going to ask them to interact a little and perhaps query each other, and I might indeed quiz them a little about what they've said. But then I want you all to contribute too and put questions to them about things they've said, or indeed points of view that you want to contribute to the discussion, okay? So I'm going to introduce each of them one at a time so that you have a proper impression of who they are rather than just offer you a list of people. And we're going to start by listening to Hannah Seinfeld. Now, Hannah is the founder and director of Yachad, and she's part of the Jewish community, and she's going to tell us what it means to be such a person.
Thank you. Can you hear me? So I'll just speak briefly because it's probably more interesting when we get to the questions. I am not I suppose what people would call a devout or religious Jew, and if I was, I probably wouldn't be here on a Saturday. So I've proved to you that I'm not by sitting here. But I grew up in a practicing household, and it's quite common inside the Jewish community to be very engaged Jewishly and not particularly religious. So I had a very Jewish upbringing and was very involved in my community as a child, and my parents were very involved in our synagogue. And my background really, and where I sit today, is you've just heard, I run an organisation called Yachad, which is building support amongst Anglo Jewry for a two-state solution and a political resolution to the conflict in Israel and Palestine. Now, I don't know how many people know about the politics of Anglo Jewry, but Israel is a very, I'm not quite sure even what word I could use to describe it, but it's explosive. Politically, it's explosive. Emotionally, it's one of the key issues that defines everything about what it means to be a Jew today to a lot of people. And it's a traditionally very male conversation, very male debate. And I think conflict as a whole and conflict resolution as a whole is often seen to be the domain of men, and politicians who sit down and negotiate and shake hands and sign agreements are men. But when you work inside a faith community, and a minority faith community, which is what I do, you are constrained also by the politics of that community. And because religion and the Jewish faith the traditional Jewish faith is very much the domain of the male, and because the way in which we situate ourselves as a minority community inside a majority culture, and the Jewish community in the last census, I think, was something like 265,000 Jews, which is less than 0.5% of the British population, there's a very strong power dynamic, particularly when you're dealing with foreign policy, which is what Israel-Palestine is, between the community and government, between the community and Israel, between the community and other campaigning organizations, and it's often has traditionally been left to men to deal with those issues. And so when a woman, and a youngish woman, comes along and starts I suppose what a lot of people would call rabble-rousing and agitating, it's quite frustrating to a lot of people. And I think that my experience has been that you're met with a lot of criticism, and a lot of that is to do with the fact that you're even meddling in a debate around Israel. But particularly as a woman, you face a different set of challenges. And I think those challenges partly come from community infrastructure. So if you want to go out and fund your organization, you have to go and get money, and you tend to go and get money inside the Jewish community from major donors, and they tend to be male. And there's a big culture around money and power, and how you break out of that dynamic, and how you don't, how as a woman who runs an organization, I don't build an organization that looks like every other Jewish community organization, where there's a group of men that fund the organization, that sit around the board table, that make the decisions, is a very difficult process, because actually there are some practicalities that you have to deal with. And the practicalities of running an organization is that you need credibility, you need money, you need power, etc., etc. And that's often defined, certainly my experience inside the Jewish community, and I think that's possibly because we're a minority community, is that when you're developing community infrastructure, you have to fund it and develop it from within, and therefore you go to people who've got money, skills, and expertise, and that's often seen to be men. You know, and I just pulled out some figures before that. the major Jewish community organisations that are seen to be the representative body of Anglo Jewry, they have a leadership of 20% that is female and 80% which is male. So it's there's an incredibly complicated problem inside the community to do with this. I'm going to finish in a minute, but one thing that I would say is that I think that when you sit on a public platform as a woman, and when you tackle what are seen to be difficult and complicated issues as a woman, I think that you expose yourself to a whole different set of challenges that you would if you were a man. And I'm not entirely sure if that's exclusively a faith thing. I don't think it is. I think it's just accentuated inside a faith community where it's traditionally very male-run and dominated. So my experience has been that when people come and level quite outrageous accusations at you that you're a self-hating Jew, or that you hate the Jewish people and you hate the state of Israel, and actually you're doing terrible things to your own community, they will also say things to you like, your hair is too curly, your dress is too short, and things that I'm not sure would ever be said to a man. And it sometimes makes me laugh because I want to say to people, I'm terribly sorry about my curly hair, but it's a Jewish gene that makes it so curly to start with. So I think that I feel that I'm presented as a woman active in the faith community with a whole different layer of challenges. So when I sit down on a panel to debate, it will be me and 4 men. And they will probably be at least 15 years older than me. And everybody will notice if I sit down and my skirt rides up and suddenly I'm sitting in a very short skirt, and it will be commented on all over the internet, which I think is a different, it presents a different set of challenges, it presents a different dynamic than if you're a man in this world. That, I think, is not exclusively a faith issue, but I do think that when you are dealing with what is a very male debate inside a very male community, it's accentuated greatly. And so I think there's a very long way to go inside the Jewish community before we have a significant change in the gender dynamic. And I think that part of that is a religious issue, which I'm not necessarily the best qualified to talk about, particularly inside more orthodox synagogues. But a lot of it is to do with the culture, and to do with money, and to do with power, and to do with how we interact with the wider world, and how we interact as a community with the rest of British society. But I will leave it there, and I'm sure we can elaborate.
Just pick you up on one word that you used, because in your negotiation with these males on panels and things, you used the word rabble-rousing, which I think is a wonderful word, and I hope you are a rabble-rouser. Excellent. But would you ever be tempted to tone down the rabble-rousing, which comes to you spontaneously, in order to, as it were, in inverted commas, woo male sympathy and present yourself as acceptable within the male world?
Well, I tell you so, I'm not sure in the context of a public domain, because you have to stake out your public platform and your organisation's position. But I tell you that I spend a lot of time raising money, and there's a very interesting experience that I had, which is that the first time I went into a room where we'd invited a group of donors and their friends around the table for a breakfast with a journalist who was speaking, it was me and 15 men in the room. And I was with a couple of my board members, both happened to be men, and one of them said, oh, why didn't we tell everybody to start? And I looked at him, and I'm by no means quiet, and you know, sort of, I don't shrink into the background when I'm sitting around my board table. I have plenty to say. And I said, I can't say anything. He said, what do you mean you can't say anything? I said, I can't speak to all of these men. And he looked at me like he didn't know who I was, and he did it. And it was really interesting, because I had to teach myself how to be assertive with men, in a room full of men. And actually, ironically, the thing that gave me a lot more confidence was when I started to walk into a room, this is going to sound awful, wearing a pair of high heels. Because it just made me feel I was as tall as everybody else. They looked at me differently. I was as important as them. And I wasn't that silly little girl making that noise in the corner, trying to get them to listen to me. And I did have a series when I started this job of recurring dreams, which I've never had before, of me, it's going to also sound ridiculous, me chasing men, very important wealthy men around buildings, begging them for 5 minutes of their time. And I had the same dream about 5 times. Each time it was a different man. I couldn't tell you where I was.
But you don't have these fears anymore.
No, not anymore.
Thank goodness. I'm very pleased about that. Right. Now we're going to hear from Tamina Kazi, who is the director of British Muslims for a Secular Democracy, which was an organisation, I think you've been in with 18 months there.
3.5 years.
Oh, 3.5 years there. One of the things that endeared me to her was when I looked up the website and found that she had approved of a banner that read, "Occupy the Mosque." I thought that sounded pretty good. And she's going to tell us about her organisation and also her background, where she comes from, and a matter of her own faith.
Thank you. The portrayal of Muslim women in the mainstream media is often framed by endless platitudes on dress codes, honour killings, and segregated weddings. I've lost count of the number of activists who have bought into these stereotypes and describe Islam as a barrier to women's empowerment. This is patronising to feminists across the world who are actively campaigning for the rights of women through an Islamic paradigm. For example, in my current role at British Muslims for Secular Democracy, I work closely with a group of Muslim students to produce a documentary that deconstructs myths and stereotypes surrounding the headscarf. Several of the participants affirmed that they covered their hair to please God, as opposed to placating their fellow human beings, and that it has not prevented them from following their professional dreams or becoming active in politics. This highlights the fact that many women, not just Muslims, view faith and spirituality as key drivers in the battle for equality and justice. It is also a pertinent example of how our societies can accommodate religious values within the framework of secular procedures and institutions. On a related note, it is increasingly important that there is high visibility surrounding positive role models for religious communities. When I worked at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, we organised the Muslim Women Power List, an awards ceremony which celebrated the achievements of Muslim women in a wide range of professions and charted their contributions to British public life. I'm of the opinion that there should be more initiatives like this. It's no coincidence that societies where women are fully fledged participants in the socio-political scene are the most successful and progressive, and this was given ample recognition in the early days of Islam, when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, appointed women to positions of authority, took their advice on political matters, and even fought alongside them on the battlefield. Not only are men and women described in the Quran as being created from a single soul, but Islamic history is packed with examples of gutsy women, such as the Prophet's first wife Khadija, a successful businesswoman, 15 years his senior, who proposed to him. In 21st century Britain, however, we have a mishmash of cultural practices masquerading as Islam, and these must be challenged both from within Muslim communities and outside them. We need to acknowledge that these crimes are often committed against women in the name of Islam and challenge the underlying motives that seek to protect individual egos while depriving women of agency and leadership. I would like to explore 2 case studies in this regard. Firstly, I'd like to focus on certain practices implemented by religious arbitration bodies in the UK. In this vein, Baroness Cox has tabled a private member's bill in the House of Lords, which I'm proud to support. The Arbitration and Mediation Services Equality Bill, which recently passed its second reading in the House of Lords, is to be lauded for its multi-pronged approach to tackling gender discrimination. Various women's groups and activists have supplied significant evidence of gender discriminatory arbitration being conducted by Sharia councils and Muslim arbitration tribunals. For example, some women report being charged twice as much as men for a religious divorce, while others struggle to get any kind of religious divorce at all, even years after separating from their husbands. While the bill doesn't mention any particular religion by name, in practice, the bulk of its remit extends to Sharia tribunals and Sharia councils. While these terms are often used interchangeably by the mainstream media, there are clear distinctions between these bodies, and the bill represents a long overdue attempt at demarcating these. This is the first key issue that I want to talk about today. Sharia tribunals operate under a clause in the Arbitration Act 1996, and as with all arbitration, their outcomes are legally binding as long as all parties agree to this. Unlike these tribunals, Sharia councils have no legal status and could potentially be set up in someone's front room. Problems arise when they falsely claim a legal status that they do not have, and this kind of posturing is exactly what the arbitration bill seeks to criminalize. It is a pioneering proposal, because the onus is on the Sharia councils to clarify for existing and potential clients that their decisions have no legal weight before any mediation can take place. It goes without saying that, like all legislation, the bill can only do so much to safeguard women from unjust treatment. The role of voluntary sector organisations in helping women to make informed choices is equally vital. But the message that comes out of most of our roundtables on religious arbitration, time and time again, is that existing legislation is not being enforced properly in these cases. It is my hope that the arbitration bill can provide a solve for some of these concerns and assist women whose struggles for justice and equality are stuck within the system. The second case study I would like to highlight is the criminalisation of forced marriage in the UK. The right to choose who you will live with, sleep with, eat with, and possibly raise children with for the rest of your life is as basic a right as they come. Violations of this right are not only disastrous for the individuals involved, but they undermine values that are fundamental to British society and Islam itself. The Human Rights Act expressly protects and promotes the right to private and family life, while Islamic history is replete with examples of the Prophet Muhammad dissolving marriages where consent had not been sought. Therefore, any action which removes the element of free and informed consent, effectively treating human beings like chattel, should be roundly condemned. A new law would help this message to finally hit home. Fear of what your family and community will think is a thread that implicitly runs through several of the anti-criminalisation arguments, but there's nothing commendable about tiptoeing around negative cultural practices. Any parent who forces their child into a marriage is not acting out of love, despite any claims to the contrary. While it's to be expected that some children would want to shield family members from the consequences of their actions for a variety of different reasons, how does this serve the cause of justice as a whole? The Quran is clear on the importance of upholding justice, even if it means testifying against family members. O ye who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to Allah, even if it be against yourselves, your parents, and your relatives, or whether it's against the rich or poor. Further, in terms of prosecutions for domestic violence, it is now well established that these can go ahead even when the victim is too scared to testify. That said, there's no reason why a new criminal offence for forced marriage could not set aside the existing civil law framework, offering victims a choice in how statutory agencies pursue the matter. My organisation has recently started a new project on forced marriage, so watch this space. It is this battle for Muslim women's empowerment which will make or break us as fully functioning, well-integrated citizens in today's Britain.
Thank you very much for that. I must say, the particular areas you outlined, divorce, forced marriage, violence against women, and so on, it seems to me that religions are particularly poor at dealing with how people come together to have their children. Like this applies to Judaism too. Church of England we'll come to in a moment. It's terrible that it affects these women in this particularly vulnerable position. Divorce seems to me particularly brutal, or getting a divorce. Is that, am I right?
Yes.
That is the hardest part of your struggle?
It certainly is. I've come across a lot of anecdotal evidence on this. A very good friend of mine, she managed to get a civil divorce after being forced into a marriage. She had a child with her husband, but she was unable to get a religious divorce for many, many years afterwards.
Now, how much does that matter to someone who is devout? Do you allow the civil divorce to prevail in your thinking, or do you feel deeply deprived if you haven't got a religious divorce?
Practically all the nearly all the Muslim women I know say that the religious divorce is absolutely essential to be able to move on with their lives and perhaps begin a new relationship, and they don't feel as though the divorce is completely finalised without that religious aspect.
Right, well, we're going to hear now from Rose Hudson-Wilkin. Rose is a member of the Church of England, a pillar of the Church of England, I think I would say, because she is chaplain to the Queen, but she's also chaplain to the House of Commons and chaplain to the House of Lords. She would, if the House of Lords had had its way, be a bishop by now. That's my personal view, but it's a view widely held, as you've made clear. So, Rose, we'd like to hear from how you've arrived where you are and what you make of your situation. Rose.
Normally, when I speak about myself and my upbringing, I often begin by saying that I had the good fortune of being born and to have grown up in Montego Bay, Jamaica. And I say that because there I saw reflections of myself in all walks of life. And so I grew up knowing that I could become whatever I wanted to be, in a sense. I grew up within the Christian tradition. I was baptized at the age of 6 months by an expatriate English Archdeacon Price, English priest, Archdeacon Price, very bushy eyebrows, I can still remember, because he was there as I got a little bit older. The Church of England was very much a part of the life of the community in Jamaica, and was actually called at one stage the Church of England in Jamaica, until we had a very bold Jamaican bishop who said, this is nonsense. Why is it the Church of England in Jamaica? It ought to be the Diocese of Jamaica, the Jamaican Church. And so we changed the name. But we were still very much Anglican, following the Book of Common Prayer and all the various traditions. I often say that I did not learn my faith in a theological college. I actually learned my faith through the older generations. My aunt who I grew up with, or aunts I should say, the women in my church, because there what I saw were people who actually lived their faith. So they may not have been academically renowned particularly, but these were ordinary people who had an amazing trust. So they would have nothing, and yet they would have everything. You know, we didn't have enough for food, and yet there was a big pot being put on the fire. And, you know, they would say, the Lord would provide. That's what we heard them saying as children. The Lord will provide. And he did. Later on that day, there was food. And there was food because whoever planted something somewhere, you can guarantee, if we didn't have refrigerators in those days, that they would actually share what they had with the neighbors or with another part of the family, etc. And they would also say things like, in God we trust. And they meant that. So what I saw growing up was a really lively faith that attracted me. I wanted that. I wanted to be a part of that. And so it felt very natural and very normal to walk into that, so to speak. And then at about age 14, I had this overwhelming sense that I was being called to be a minister in the church. Now, this is a very weird feeling because, of course, we don't have women priests. They were all men. I did remember asking our bishop at the time, why is it you have taught us that the sacrament is important, having the Holy Communion? So why is it then that some of our congregations are starved of it because we don't have a priest? And he said, well, that's the situation. We don't have enough priests to go around. And I had the pertinence to say, but there are lots of women in the churches. We don't have women as priests. That's the Anglican way. I always remember that. We don't have women as priests. So, in effect, I was saying to God, I really believe that you have called me, and you're just going to have to work this out. I didn't know how he was going to do it, but you're going to have to work it out because I really believe that I'm called to do this. And so I continued to pursue ministry. At no time in the years and years ahead did I say to myself, you know what, they're not ordaining women, I'm off to join whoever or whatever. I didn't pick up my marbles to go and play somewhere else. I stayed. And there is a sense in which 1994, when we were first ordained as priests, was quite a seminal moment Because in the excitement of my own ordination, I saw women who were now my grandmother's age, women who were standing, who had been faithful throughout their lives, but now it was too late for them to be ordained. And so I felt as if, you know, when you have given birth and you're excited, but you're consciously aware that the woman in the next room, her baby has died. So your excitement is sort of tempered by the fact that there are others who have lost. So here I am still within the church, the Anglican Church, very much conscious of the fact that it is a male-dominated church when it comes to leadership. And not only male-dominated, but also very white. And you may say, but you're in England, what are you talking about? Yes, I know I'm in England. But actually, when you look at a city like London, which is extremely diverse, when you look at some of our cities and go into some of our churches in our cities, if it weren't for the minority ethnic people in those churches, the Church of England would not have a presence in those places, in places like Hackney, where I live, for example, in other cities in Birmingham, etc. So I think that the church has got to seriously look at how it is going to change. If we're wanting to seriously make an impact on the community that we serve, then the church will need to look at itself and begin to ask questions about how we can enable all in the community to actually see themselves in the leadership of the church so that they too can say yes. In the same way that Mary initially said yes when she gave birth to Jesus, etc., etc. We need our young people in particular, pink people, black people, blue people, white people, young people. We want them to see images of themselves. So I'm afraid some of our more older white male who have inhabited those positions of leadership within the church will need to think again about how they give up the status of being in an all-boys club, an old boys club. Yeah.
Okay. Rose, thank you. Can I ask you why you think God is dragging his feet? If you expected when you were young that he'd have to come in and make the changes, why is he taking so long about it?
Yes. I actually don't think that it is God who is dragging his feet or her feet. The reality is that unfortunately we have human vessels in the same way we have human vessels exercising leadership within the various religious traditions. And we have somehow got the sort of cultural thing mixed up with religion. And it's partly because of our humanity. We don't know how to express things than in our human ways. And so we use the human clothing and we say, actually, you know, because men are kings of the castles, then we translate that into the religious domain. So it's not about what, you know, this is not God's doing, this is man's doing.
Can I ask, before I come to the, we're going to have the lights up in a moment, I want you to join this discussion. But I just want to put a question to you because it's called The Politics of the Divine. And Rose has spoken about her calling to serve God. And I wonder, in a sense, because I am a non-believer and was brought up in the Church of England, of which I, in a sense, have despaired, why you have stayed as highly intelligent, motivated women within the religious world, where women seem to me to have the biggest put down of any sort of grouping in our society. Why have you stuck with it? Tell me, what makes you stay so wedded to your religion and being part of that?
Because I passionately believe in what I suppose many would call, for want of a better word, progressive interpretations of Islam, which highlight justice and equality, and gender equality is a fundamental part of that. The fact that you don't see this reflected in mainstream Muslim institutions is, as Rose said, the fault of the people running them. And if we were to leave these faith traditions or these faith communities completely, then there'd be no hope of change at all.
It's very... And you, Hannah, too, do you ever despair of those those rooms full of males that you have to seek to influence?
Frequently. I'm not sure my answer is quite as ideologically driven. I think, truthfully, I am where I am partly out of circumstance rather than a specific active choice to be inside the Jewish community. It's just where I found myself. But there is just one thing I wanted to pick up on, something that Rose said, which I think really rang true, that this idea that we have somehow mixed up faith and gender and culture and turned it into religious interpretation, when actually what it is a reality that a lot of our religions have developed in very male communities, in very patriarchal communities, and we then turn those patriarchal interpretations into religious doctrine, or people's perception is that it's religious doctrine. And there's a very interesting thing that's happened in the Jewish community recently, which is that there's several different synagogue bodies of different denominations in the United Kingdom, and the United Synagogue, which is the traditional Orthodox established body of Anglo Jewry, where the majority of the community who are members of synagogues are members, and yet the majority of those members are not religious Jews, but it's the synagogue that their parents, their grandparents, or it's down the road, or they've just found themselves there, has only in the last, I think, 6 months made it basically legal for women to be the chairperson of a synagogue. So any synagogue has a board, which is made up of its members, and the board employs the rabbi, and the board effectively decision makes for the synagogue. And until about 3 months ago, women could not be the chair of a community. And the grounds on which it was justified was that there were some things that women religiously can't do, and if it fell to the lay leader of the community, and that would be the chair of the synagogue, to perform a religious duty, and they wouldn't be able to because they were a woman, they couldn't do the job. Or if they had to meet the rabbi one-on-one to discuss issues to do with the community, religious men won't necessarily sit in a room on their own with a woman who's not their partner with the door closed. So I have, for example, had to meet with certain rabbis and sat in their living room with the front door open, which you can make of that what you will. But interestingly, there were a number of Orthodox synagogues who didn't, it just makes me laugh this, who didn't put in place a chair, and the woman was the vice chair. So she was the de facto chair of the synagogue because there was no chair, and it was a way to get around this interpretation. And so I think it's really interesting what you're saying, because a lot of people have placed a religious interpretation on what is effectively, I think, a cultural, sexist decision that women can't be the chair of a synagogue. And so it was a big struggle inside those synagogues to say, actually, it is okay for now for women to be chairs of the community.
That's all we've got time for. I'm going to have to draw this discussion to a close, and what a regret I have, because clearly everybody is very engaged with these issues, and I think we couldn't have had a more inspiring panel. I have to say, aren't they wonderful? Please. Thank you.